Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream live on Al Jazeera and YouTube. For the first time in 60 years, Cuba has a new president whose last name isn't Castro. So what will new leadership mean for the country? Thursday, President Raul Castro stepped down, handing over power to his first vice president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. It's unclear the path Diaz-Canel will take as leader, but one thing is certain. He becomes president at a time when Cuba faces a serious economic crisis, compounded by the dwindling subsidies from Venezuela and the continuation of U.S. embargoes. Well, Al Jazeera Latin American editor Lucia Newman joins us live from the capital, Havana, where she's reporting on this historic event. Lucia, welcome to the stream. Describe for us the mood in Havana right now. What's the atmosphere like? What are people thinking about this historic event?
Well, Malika, what they're really thinking is that it is historic in a way, but that the change isn't radical, not the least. In fact, what you have is a change, but with more or less the same script. You have a president who has stepped down, but who isn't going very far at all. Raul Castro will remain as the head of the Communist Party, which is the most important organization, really, political organization of Cuba, and he will remain there for another 3 years, right by the new president's side. That was made very, very clear. So when you speak to ordinary Cubans on the streets, as I did, I was first of all surprised that a lot of them weren't even listening to the speeches that were taking place at the National Assembly. They said, well, you know, this is a transition. Everything in this country is gradual. It always is, and it will continue to be that way. Some young people, though, said that they had hoped that were hoping that the new president, being from a younger generation, would speed up the kind of reforms that Raul Castro had begun, but which they believe are absolutely insufficient. They want more freedom of information, more freedom to have their own businesses. They, of course, want to have improvements in the economy that you just alluded to, but they're not really quite sure how much this new president will be able to do, at least in the short term.
Change isn't radical, and that, of course, Castro will remain the head of the party. So that said, what about the rest of the government? Because or are they staying in place?
Well, some of them remain in place. One of them, Machado Ventura, has gone, but he remains as the second secretary of the Communist Party. And there is expected to be this gradual change of what some people call the dinosaurs to the younger generation. And I think the most significant thing of all is that Diaz-Canel asked for a postponement of the naming of his cabinet until the next time that the National Assembly meets. That's in July. And there is a sense that he may name completely different people to the cabinet that are not necessarily members of the Council of State, as has been the case up until now. And that should give him some independence. But again, remember, Raul Castro, who is of the historic generation of the Cuban Revolution, will remain very much watching what happens for at least another 3 years until the next Cuban Communist Party Congress. He said that if all goes well, then he will really hand over. Then that transition from the end of the Castro era will really take place, and that's in 3 years' time. He says if his health accompanies him, he will then become, quote, just another soldier of the Cuban Revolution.
Well, we will continue to watch during that time as well. Lucia Newman, thank you for joining us today. So with Castro's legacy in the rearview mirror, what will Cuba's future look like under a new leader? Well, joining us to discuss this, in Texas, Arturo Lopez Levy. He is a Cuban political analyst and author of Raul Castro and the New Cuba. He also once worked for the Cuban government. In New York, Harold Cardenas Lema, a Cuban political analyst. In Missouri, Amalia Dache Gerbino. She's a Cuban-American professor at the University of Missouri. And in Miami, Ramon Sao Sanchez. He's the director of Democracy Movement. That's an organization that seeks political change in Cuba. Welcome to the stream, all of you. And I want to start on my laptop because, of course, there is lots of reaction to this news online. This is via Twitter. This is Eduardo Sanchez, who writes, the new president, Diaz-Canel, until today, most likely candidate hopeful. Listening to the new president of Cuba, there will be continuity, but the president has his own ideas and has always applied them when assuming a position for Cuba. Harold, how are you feeling today?
Actually, I'm feeling hopeful for the future, for the things to come. I think that today Diaz-Canel showed that this is a continuity and not a rupture. That's very important for domestic politics. He was very careful not to undermine the older generation. That proves that he's also very smart. He knows how to play the rules. I think that he's a much more relatable person than it appears. Cuban politicians has been for long not being very publicly show what they do and what they think. I think he can do much better than that. I'm hopeful, but I'm hopeful that he can further speed the changes in Cuba, but that also depends on the U.S. The more hostile the United States is towards Cuba, the less changes we're going to have.
Ramon, you heard Harold. He's hopeful. Are you feeling as hopeful?
Unfortunately, we just had a succession of power, not a transition of democracy. Diaz-Canel was elected by Raul Castro only, and this assembly that is structured to abide by the will of the dictator. The Cuban people did not have a say in electing Diaz-Canel to power. But things could change because new faces are now entering the Cuba scenario. The people are already tired of withstanding 60 years of oppression and dictatorship, division of the Cuban families, a disrupted economy, totally destroyed. And they have the need to live in a society where they can enjoy human rights and civil rights. So the pressure inside, and also the international community realizing this is a dictatorship and not a socialist revolution, as they like to call it, those pressure could end up helping some changes in the future.
So, Ramon, of course, clearly this is not necessarily a welcome move for you. I want to share with our audience how much so this is not a welcome move. This is a headline in Spanish, but this week you organized protests in Miami against this transfer of power, as you called it. What is it that you were calling for and that you gathered people in Miami to call for? You can see here a few pictures of people who gathered in the streets of Miami. What were you calling for?
What we're asking for is for the government to allow a process to ask the Cuban people what type of system they want. The Cuban people have been imposed upon them a socialist, quote-unquote socialist system by the Castro family that they haven't chosen to have. They haven't been asked what type of system they want, and they haven't elected directly the leaders. In fact, when they had these voting process a few months ago, to set up the local assemblies and then the National Assembly, any opposition member that wanted to run for these posts were repressed, were incarcerated. Even Diaz-Canel said that they had to do everything possible to prevent these people from becoming elected, because if any of them got to the National Assembly, that would be a problem for them. So this needs to change.
So we're talking about him. Let's hear from him. Shortly after the exchange of power, the new president, President Miguel Diaz-Canel, addressed Cuba's National Assembly. And here's what he had to say about the legacy of the Castros. Have a listen.
I assume the responsibility for which I have been elected with the conviction that all the Cuban revolutionaries, from whichever position we hold, from whichever work we do, from whichever job we hold in the trenches of the socialist nation, we will be faithful to the exemplary legacy of the Commander-in-Chief, Fidel Castro Ruz, historic leader of our revolution, and also to the example, the value, and teachings of Armed Force General Raul Castro Ruz.
So Arturo, what do we know about this new president? Of course, he served as vice president for about 5 years under Raul Castro, but what is it that the public actually knows about him?
Well, Malika, I would like to address the issue of whether this is democratic or not democratic. I think it's clear it's not democratic in the liberal sense that we consider here in the United States, but at the same time, it is not good to look at this in absolute terms. within this, there are changes within the system and changes that will take the system to a different type of politics. And I think that Diaz-Canel, within the boundaries of the system, has shown some important assets that make him a good candidate to the position that he has, that, by the way, was not only selected by Raul Castro. There are some procedures there that basically put a boundary with people that cooperate with foreign powers, and they are strict with opposition that in some cases, in my view, they should tolerate. But it is not, we are not talking about North Korea or a dynasty or anything like that. And within this Leninist structure, because I think that the country has a Leninist structure, Diaz-Canel has been an efficient and pragmatic leader within the framework of the system. He has cultivated an image of someone close to the people. He has cultivated an image of modesty. He was key in the implementation of important reforms that already took place in terms of opening the country to foreign investment in the two strategic provinces of Villa Clara and Holguin. He was part of the effort to improve relations with the religious communities that are the most important and largest groups in civil society outside the control of the Communist Party. And last but not least, the implementation of some important policies that are changing the relationship between the state and society, opening to an important private sector, an expansion of the access to internet that Harold Cardenas can talk a little about this because he has some direct experience on that. And last but not least, the opening of the right to travel to Cubans. Since October 2013, the Cubans who before required an exit visa to travel, now they are traveling all abroad. So we are seeing a more open society, and he's behind all that.
By any standard, in Cuba, there is no democracy. This is not a different type of system.
Well, I don't like the standard. I don't like to take the U.S. democracy as a standard. I would prefer
I don't take it either. I'm talking about Cuba.
I will go to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights model. And through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights model, there are areas in which Cuba has a successful implementation of rights and areas.
So Arturo, I hear what you're saying, and Ramon, I hear your disagreement there. I want to bring in a community because they also want to weigh in on this. Luis says Diaz-Canel has an increasing opportunity to model the country on his own vision, but he's not immune to internal politics in the party. He will have to learn to pilot the country himself, with Raul Castro maintaining an essential veto power. Keeping that in mind, I wouldn't expect big changes soon. Amalia, I haven't heard your voice in a minute, and I see you shaking your head there. What do you think of this?
I think that, my conjecture is that, Diaz-Canel is really a figurehead. Raul Castro is still going to have, substantial power. We remember when Fidel came into power, he wasn't the president of Cuba, but he was the leader of the Communist Party, but he still ran the country. And so I think it's important to kind of contextualize the fact that we know he's going to be a figurehead. And I think there's not going to be that much change coming from Raul Castro presidency.
Harold?
Yeah, actually, I don't agree. I think Diaz-Canel is a leader on his own. And I also don't agree with the previous statements done. I think that any change in Cuba cannot be a result of foreign pressure. I would like to add also that there is some hypocrisy in criticizing, for example, Russian influence in the U.S., and at the same time supporting U.S. meddling in Cuba. And that is the same to me. I believe in political participation of everybody in Cuba, like someone told before me, but I don't agree that the groups that have supported a regime change policy paid by foreign governments should be allowed to do that. First, we have to be a sovereign country, and I would love to have everybody joining, but they have to be nationalists first. You have to respond to national interest, not to foreign interests.
May I say something in regards to that?
Go
we
ahead.
are Cubans. We don't adhere to the foreign policies of the United States at all. In fact, I don't believe in the embargo. However, the Cuban regime has subjected Cuba's sovereignty to the Russians, had done that for decades, and we didn't hear many people protest that. What we're saying right now is that the Cuban people need to be empowered to vote for the leaders and to vote for the system they want. The Cuban people in the island.
But you make the argument as if in the U.S. we have the same type of power, as if in the U.S. we have a democracy, as if in the U.S. we actually use the popular vote to elect our president, right? So I think as Cuban Americans, right, it's always interesting to see how we challenge Cuba on policy, but when it comes to domestic policy in the U.S., Cuban Americans are super silent when it comes to Black Lives Matter, gun violence, human rights abuses of the United States. So please, I really think it's important to contextualize your Americanness within your Cubanness and understand how the U.S. has been a oppressive system to many of the global South and Latin America.
Okay,
so
I hear where you're coming, Amalia. I want to give Ramon a chance to respond to that. Ramon?
Can I say something else?
Well, Ramon first, and then you'll get in, Arturo. Go ahead, Ramon.
Cuba is an oppressive dictatorship. None of you can say the name of at least one candidate that in 60 years was allowed to run for the presidency of Cuba. None of you can say the day in which the Cuban people was consulted to have what they call socialism, which I believe Castro shot socialism in the head by his destructive regime.
But socialist policies have been very beneficial for Cuba. Higher education, sustainability, they're leading. They're leading in Latin American educational statistics. So how are you understanding democracy? Do we have a democracy in the United States?
Okay,
Do we have a democracy in the United States?
Amalia and Ramon, I'm actually going to jump in there because the exact ends of the spectrum that you guys are on, our community is also on, and I want to share that, just so you know you're not alone on either side of the spectrum. So on one hand, Alberto here on Twitter says Raul Castro's legacy in Cuba is one of brutal repression, destruction, and death. The same as his brothers. Diaz-Canel's impact will be whatever Raul Castro and the Castro family dictatorship decides it will be. He is a figurehead. On the other side of that spectrum, though, here is Eduardo Sanchez. He says, as a great challenge, Cubans born after the revolution understand social rights like universal education and healthcare as inalienable human rights, the achievements of the revolution. Going back to what you were saying, Amalia, he says it is key for the new administration to maintain such rights while enacting needed reforms. So, Arturo, I promised I would get you in here. Taking that in mind, pushing this conversation forward, there were reforms enacted by Raul Castro. Some would say, of course, they did not go far enough. But do you see this new government being able to push them even further?
I think so. And let me tell something in support of Professor Amalia, that it is important to look and to measure the advancement and the progress on human rights, not with an American standards or with particular standards. There are international standards of human rights. And it's clear that there are statistics that are not even taken by the Cuban government that show in some areas, particularly on economic, cultural, and social rights, in which Cuba has success that an objective observer will recognize. At the same time, I think that if you measure Cuba or contrast Cuba with the standards of human rights in some areas, such as civil and political rights, there are things there that need to be improved, and a significant improvement is needed. The administration of Raul Castro, you might say whatever, but even the data, the big organization of human rights like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they have acknowledged that in areas such as freedom of religion, the areas such as right to travel, areas such as the right to own private property, there has been a significant improvement in the last 10 years.
Okay.
It is satisfying, no.
I can
but
just be quiet and hear this, because this
okay,
is
Arturo, I hear what you're saying, Ramon. Go ahead, Ramon.
You are uttering the results of these reports that Amnesty International have repeatedly made, that Cuba violates every single human right contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Cuban families have been divided.
They are very critical on the area of civil and political rights.
All right, Ramon and Arturo, only because you're talking at the same time. I hear your point, but I don't know their audience will. So I want to push us forward a little bit and give us one concrete example that I know all of you might have different thoughts on. And this is the economy. Take a look at this headline here. Cuba's next president faces a choice between the economy and communism. This is via The Hill. We actually got a video comment from someone in our community on that specific point. This is Yasser Alejandro Padrón, and this is what he told the stream.
A ver, en realidad no estamos todavía en una Cuba post-Castro como tal. Raúl va a permanecer durante mucho tiempo al frente del Partido Comunista y lo que sí podemos observar es una nueva generación que no tiene el mismo tipo de legitimidad que tenía la generación histórica, pero que va a formar gobierno y que los cubanos la vamos a estar observando, vamos a valorarla por la capacidad que tenga para resolver los grandes problemas económicos que enfrenta el país, que no son pocos, y que sobre eso lo que podemos decir es que realmente lo quisiéramos es un futuro mejor.
So Harold, he says that this new government is going to have to resolve the economic problems the country is in. Do you see that happening?
I wish that could be done, and I know it's very hard, but I want to add also to what my colleague said, that socially Cuba is today a much better nation than it was before. It's true that economically we are not much better, but we don't really know because the embargo actually distorts everything. We don't know how much the Cuban economy works or not because the embargo influences on everything. And right now in this debate, we're stuck in this narrative, well, like what Ramon says when he makes a statement with cliche words and ideas. We're stuck in a narrative that is bipolar, that says that Cuba is black or Cuba is white, that Cuba everything is good and everything is bad. It's not that. Cuba has good things and bad things. And my generation only wants to have a normal country, to have a good relation with the U.S., and to be able to change the things that we need to change to make it better. And I actually think that Diaz-Canel can be very good in this.
Amalia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this conversation of the economy is important to contextualize within sustainable development, right? So in the 1990s, during a special period, when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, Cuba was really forced to push itself in its imagination and innovation when it came to sustainable development, right? Like workers' co-ops, agriculture, urban farming. Cuba's leading one of the most sustainable countries in the world, right? So when you think about the economy and capitalism, we have to understand that there's major environmental gains that Cuba has been leading, having to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So sometimes the economy collapses, but then when it comes to sustainability, we win, right? We win as global citizens. So I think it's important to contextualize the environment and climate when it comes to the economy as well.
Yeah, I would like to add something.
Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, I would like to add that for a long time, it has been presented, this relation between Cuba and the U.S. as an ideological thing. It's not ideological. For Cubans, it's pretty much a fight for sovereignty. And that hasn't been shown like that in the United States. It has also been shown like this is communism and ideology and things. At least for my generation, it's not. It's the struggle of a country to make it on its own and to have a good relation with another country that doesn't accept it.
I think, Malika, that you need to recognize that...
So Arturo and Ramon started talking at the exact same time. So Arturo, you finish up your sentence, and Ramon, you go after.
Yes. I think that this person, Yasser, mentioned, it is important. The reality is that many improvement in economic welfare for the people, access to education, access to health, will not be sustainable without a sustainable economy.
Okay. Arturo, I heard what you said there. I have to pause you because we're running out of time. Ramon, last word.
Well, I didn't finish anything, but it's okay.
Economically and politically and in terms of human rights is a lot worse, unfortunately, than before this revolution. And we hope that Diaz-Canel can do something for the Cuban people. Otherwise, it will be a lengthening of the same dictatorship that it has had for 60 years.
Ending on a hopeful note there. I think something we can all agree on. I'll end with this tweet from Luis, who says the biggest political challenge in Cuba is a generational shift in government. This government will have to produce results for a new generation that is asking for change rather than relying on the defeat of the dictatorship 60 years ago. Our thanks to all of our guests and, of course, to our community for joining us in this conversation. Of course, it continues online with #AJStream. See you there.